This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News. This week's featured stories cover financial matters and economic matters, things that affect our nation's economy and your money and financial future. So our focus this week is money and economics. So let's start with an overall economic update, and then we'll get into some specific policy issues and current events. So another week of positive economic news as the Fed and Congress flood markets with money. Discounting the effect of energy prices, monetary inflation was almost non-existent in February. Soaring energy prices did push total consumer prices up at 3% annually. Both measures of inflation remained below 2% on a year-over-year basis. Initial unemployment claims for the first week in March and the number of people receiving unemployment payments also continued to trend lower. We did see some early signs of coming inflationary pressures, which will intensify in the year ahead. The housing market is booming in the suburbs as safety concerns cause more and more people to flee major cities and relocate to suburban locations. Real disposable income was more than 12% above its prior peak of a year ago. This indicates that there's plenty of spending power to drive retail sales higher. After Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's recent testimony to Congress, there will be nothing new. Stock prices moved decisively higher this week. News reports credited the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill for the rebound. The idea is there'll be a flood of spending as the federal checks get cashed. Spending will soar, but the reason is because the Fed will buy all the new debt. The Fed will also be the source of much higher inflation and much higher interest rates. When the Treasury borrows $1.9 trillion to pay for those checks, it takes the entire $1.9 trillion of spending power out of the economy. The first signs of trouble in financial markets will come as inflationary expectations drive longer-term interest rates above the yield on stocks and as the spread between short and longer-term interest rates begin to narrow. But the party in the stock market can continue as long as the Federal Reserve is willing to keep refilling that punch bowl. Another significant impact on the economy and your money is the recent so-called stimulus passed by Congressional Democrats and signed by President Biden. Economist Stephen Moore wrote an article entitled, "Red States Should Revolt Against the Blue State Bailout." Moore writes the following: Congressional Democrats are on a runaway train with a drunk-on-power conductor and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. No matter how much evidence pours in that the economy doesn't need $1.9 trillion more in debt spending, the Pelosi locomotive keeps crashing down the track towards the financial cliff. Generations will have to pay for this joyride. One of the worst features of the bill is the blue state bailout. 21 Republican governors and 1 Democrat are protesting the biased formula for allocating some $400 billion to the states. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster complained that the bill punishes states that did the right thing by keeping their economies and businesses open during the pandemic. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said the bill loots the red states to pay for Democratic governors who have locked down their economies. DeSantis has a good reason to complain. Florida has a slightly higher population than New York, but New York gets $2,799 per person, or twice as much money as the $1,355 per person that Florida receives. In other words, Floridians are paying for New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's incompetence. That is precisely what's happening, because the main factor in determining how much money each state gets is not its population, but how high its unemployment rate has risen. The 3 states that get the most significant share of this money are New York, California, and New Jersey. These are the 3 of the most liberal states with Democratic governors. That's not a coincidence. Blue state Pennsylvania gets more per person than red state Ohio. Blue state Massachusetts and red state Tennessee are about the same size, but somehow Massachusetts receives $1.5 billion more in handouts. Connecticut gets twice as much bailout money as Utah, despite the fact they're about the same size in population. The governor's joint statement says, quote, "A state's ability to keep businesses open and people employed should not be a penalizing factor when distributing funds. If Congress is going to provide aid to states, it should be on an equitable population basis," end quote. But it isn't. The way Congress passes out money is akin to assigning the highest performing students an F and the lowest performers an A. Maybe this is what the left means by equity. The last shall be first. Most red states have already balanced their budgets. So how will Republican governors use this free money? Here's a better idea. Rather than squander the money with more bureaucratic spending and the risk of inflating a financial bubble in their state budgets in years ahead, devote every penny of these funds to finance tax reform and relief. 8 states have no income tax. These are Alaska, Nevada, South Dakota, Washington, Florida, Wyoming, Tennessee, and Texas. It would be rough justice for the blue state bailout. If Democrats take the red states' money, Republican governors should make their states income tax-free havens and steal the blue states' families and businesses. The states without any income taxes create twice as many jobs as the high-tax blue states. If you think California, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York are melting down now, just wait until they have to compete against regions in the country in the South and the mountain states with no income taxes. Moving on to our next report. So again, talking about this COVID relief bill and this blue state bailout, we're told all of this is to address economic fallout from the 2020 shutdowns. So let's talk about how much the GDP declined in 2020. Budget and Tax News reports that the pandemic reduced GDP by about 4% in 2020. But the virus also disrupted public education, an impact that is missed in the GDP calculation. School disruption may also have a financial impact. Much government spending produces significant value, such as the roads and highways enabling travel and commerce, and the police officers charged with protecting the property rights necessary for economic investment. But some spending is questionable. Private schools produce similar measurable learning outcomes as government schools at a much lower cost per student on average. Now, consider the impact of school disruption, which largely affected government schools while most private schools remained open. Estimates suggest that only 20 to 30% of students nationally are now in school full-time. Some additional students attend a couple of days per week with some hybrid learning. Current measures indicate sharply reduced learning with virtual schooling. Younger children, special needs students, and students from low-income households have been the most affected. These students need the personal attention and relatively distraction-free environment of the classroom. Yet spending on public schools has not gone down. Most teachers and staff are still drawing full salaries. Public schools supervise students during the day in addition to teaching. Some disparagingly refer to this as free babysitting. But economists would say that schools jointly produce learning and supervision. The loss of daytime supervision has burdened parents, and particularly mothers. In January, the labor force participation rate for women hit a 33-year low. If half the total value, meaning learning plus supervision, normally created was lost, this is an extra $400 billion hit to the GDP. COVID-19's economic impact might have actually been 6% of GDP, not 4%. Due to all of this virtual schooling in some states, which still continue in some states today, the effective decline in GDP in 2020 was likely greater than measured, an economic loss with very real human costs. So now a little hopeful news, a battle being waged to improve the long-term economic outlook and impact on your financial future. So we'll move on to the next story, which is the Heartland Institute joined forces with a coalition of groups led by DC-based Citizens Against Government Waste, we're going to call that CAGW, to oppose efforts in the U.S. House of Representatives to restore the budgetary practice of earmarks. Earmarks are congressional spending directed at specific projects, often used to bypass the normal merit-based competitive allocation process and executive branch oversight. They've been banned since Republicans ended earmarks in 2010 to stop abuses involving wasteful spending and corruption. One of the most infamous cases was the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska, in which $223 million of federal funding was secured by the Alaska Congressional delegation for a bridge connecting Ketchikan, Alaska to Gravina Island, a place with only 50 residents. After public backlash, the earmark was withdrawn and the bridge was never built, even though $300 million was eventually appropriated for it. The episode served as impetus for the congressional earmark ban in 2010. One of the CAGW's top priorities has been opposition to earmarks. Since 1991, the organization has published an annual Congressional Pig Book, compiling a list of federal pork barrel projects, which CAGW defines as a line item in an appropriations bill that designates tax dollars for a specific purpose in circumvention of established budgetary procedures. CAGW launched the coalition letter to oppose recent proposals by the House and Senate Appropriations Chairmen, both Democrats, to restore earmarks under the euphemism of member-directed spending. The letter reads, quote, "Proponents of earmarks argue that they would promote the passage of appropriation bills in a timely manner, but this is proven false by the fact that appropriations bills have been enacted on time in only 4 years since the passage of the 1974 Budget Act. In fact, They waste the taxpayers' money as a form of legalized bribery, under which a few $1 million in earmarks are traded for votes in favor of hundreds of billions of dollars in spending. In a recent op-ed in The Hill, CAGW President Tom Schatz expressed strong opposition to a specific proposal to restore earmarks by the House Select Committee on Modernization of Congress. He said, quote, "Few members of Congress remain who served in fiscal year 2006 when the cost of earmarks reached a record $29 billion, and members of Congress, staff, and lobbyists began going to jail. New members must understand the substantial inequities, corruption, and costs associated with earmarks." End quote. Schatz called on legislators to pass the Earmark Elimination Act, first introduced in the House and Senate in 2018. Congressional Democrats have been supportive of restoring earmarks. Republicans have generally opposed the idea. In a recent article in Politico, House Freedom Caucus member Warren Davidson, a Republican from Ohio, wrote, quote, "They're a bad idea. I'm opposed to them. They've been described as a gateway drug towards corruption." End quote. GOP opposition has not been unanimous, however, with some Republicans arguing earmarks could mitigate the spending authority of the Biden administration and increase budget transparency. With a national debt at $28 trillion, earmarks having a history of corruption, Republicans are under pressure from the conservative base to resist the temptation to restore them. And that's it. That's this week's Heartland View, Fast and Furious. There's a lot going on public policy-wise that will have a long-term impact on our economy and your financial future. The Heartland Daily News is working to provide you with information and analysis that you need to stay informed and to stand up for your freedom. So please keep watching our weekly news segments, share it with friends, like us on social media, and if you'd like to support an organization that's providing information and analysis to give you the knowledge that you need to fight for your freedoms, consider supporting the work of the Heartland Institute. Thank you for your time. Have a great week.